modernism also. So let me go to the calendar and share my screen. There it is. So today we're going to talk about 20th century poetry. There's only a handful of poems for us to look at today, and modernists were kind of minimalists too. So they did not write really long poems in general. There are a couple of exceptions, but in general. So we'll look at those today, and we'll be applying the qualities of modernism and postmodernism to those poems. Just a reminder that essay number 2 is due on Tuesday. I have been reading people's papers. People have been, as it's getting closer to the due date, people have been giving me partial drafts or asking me to help them search for sources and that kind of thing. So if you run into trouble, if you're working on your paper this weekend and you need a little assistance, feel free to send me an email and I'll do my best to help you meet that deadline. Also remember that discussion number 9 is our last discussion of the term, and the post for that is due tomorrow. So it's about the importance of being earnest, and we went over that a little bit on Tuesday. So moving into next week will be our last class meeting week, and Tuesday and Thursday we'll be talking about some pieces of modernist fiction. And Friday, I have on the schedule to have a review kind of question and answer about the final exam. But probably Thursday, I'll ask you if you want to go ahead and do that. Sometimes it's good to have the study guide there and, ask the instructor to talk about how things are going to appear on the test or to go over any of the particular topics that are present there. So on Thursday, after we talk about the garden party, I'll ask you if you want to have that, because maybe you would rather use the time to study. So I'll just do a little quick poll or something on that day to see how you all are feeling about it. And then that'll wrap up all of our class meetings. It'll be up to you to make sure that you get the exam done the following week. And then my grades are due on the 17th. So we're coming up to the end of things here. All right, let me start for today, with this information here. Tuesday, I was talking about 20th century literature in general. And today we're going to go into a little more detail as we look at some poems that demonstrate the modernist and the postmodernist qualities. So I do have this image in Blackboard. If you go to the unit and go to additional materials, you should be able to access it there if you wanted to have your own copy of that. But just let me go through the qualities and then we'll look at some poems. So modernist English literature, when we think of 20th century, it's kind of broken in half. The first, my screen's backwards because of the art image. The first part of the 20th century is modernism. And modernism started off with kind of a new and bold approach using imagism and other techniques. But just like we see modern art changing, we also see poetry changing at the very beginning of the 20th century. Imagists wrote poems that were extremely short, just one image, one little snippet, one little idea. And we'll look at some examples of imagist poetry, because they looked at Victorian poetry and they said, oh, look how long these things are. And look back at the Romantics, right? Byron wrote a 75-page poem. And so the imagist said, how can we make it new? How can we make poetry new again and not rely on the old traditions? And so imagism is one of the ways that they answered that. I like the way that, I think I mentioned this on Tuesday, but I like the way that my instructor that I had in undergraduate mentioned and sort of talked about imagism. And she said that it's kind of like if you're in a room and there's a door that's closed, but somebody opens the door slightly to exit, and you can kind of see what's going on in that room, and the door closes. That's imagist poetry, because you're just given this one little moment in time, and it's more about the image than it is about anything else in the poem. Modernist literature shifts because, like we were talking about on Tuesday, of the influence of World War I. So World War I comes in, and the sort of excitement about being new and different in a new century shifts and becomes more about fear and the horrors of war and sort of a cynical approach to writing about the world and writing about what's going on and what, the ideas that people wanted to present. So modernist literature kind of has a little bit of an arc where it starts in one place and ends in a different place. And we'll look at some examples of that. Postmodernist literature starts in the second half of the 20th century. So after World War II, going into the 1950s, we realized that there really is a shift in the thinking in literature of the time. And the focus tends to shift more toward social change, political justice, cultural studies, critical lenses, things like that, that we recognize more with the things that we really do nowadays. I don't know if the literature that's being written now in 2021 is going to be part of the postmodernist movement, or whether we'll look back 50 years from now and say, you know what, there really was a shift at this point, and postmodernism ended around 2002, and now we're in something else. It's too close to that for history to judge that, but I think most people are going on the mindset that there's sort of the waning of postmodernist movement, and we're just sort of waiting to see what's how the literature is going to be perceived in the future. I do think that it's important to note on postmodernism that there is a concern about diversity of perspectives, and we don't see that a whole lot in literature leading up to this point. But there's the idea of the danger of a single narrative, which is the idea that you can only look at something from one point of view. In the second half of the 20th century, writers and people in general started to realize that a lot of the history, a lot of the literature, and just the social narrative was written by white men who were Christian. And there's nothing wrong with that, but there are other voices in the world, and especially with the influx of immigrants during the Victorian times, people in Britain started to validate and look for voices in multiple cultures, different backgrounds. And so postmodernist literature is concerned about having just one approach to looking at morality or just one approach to looking at art. It's about how many different vantage points can you perceive in this piece of literature. And that's where the critical lenses come in. That's really only a study since the beginning of postmodernist times in the 50s and 60s. And that continues today because we did critical lenses last semester. And some of you are writing about them in your paper for this semester. So that's something that we consider a postmodernist view. Okay, so hopefully that's enough to kind of go through some poetry. I'm going to go through the poetry selections. If you click right here, you can get the PDF. Also, it's in the reading section, I believe, right here. I'm going to go through the PDF of the poetry selections and kind of point out those qualities of modernism and postmodernism in these selections. So the first one that we have, actually the first two are Imagist poems. The first one is by Ezra Pound. Now, Ezra Pound is sort of like the father of Imagism, and he was American, but he influenced the writing of, people like James Joyce, who was, British. He was Irish, but he, is in the realm of our studies in this course. And Ezra Pound wrote probably the most famous Imagist poem, which is this one up here that's just 2 lines long. It says, "The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough." That's it. So it's a comparison, right? He's comparing the faces that he sees on the people at the train station to petals that are on a wet black tree branch. And so you can see how that's like that doorway, right? That's like just seeing something for the moment and then it's gone. It's just that one sort of transitory moment in time. It's like a snapshot. Here's one by James Joyce, and the whole image is about his daughter holding a flower that he gave her. Frail the white rose, and frail are her hands that gave, whose soul is sere and paler than time's wan wave. Rose frail and fair, yet frailest, a wonder wild, in gentle eyes thou veilest my blue-veined child. So not only does this one demonstrate the idea of imagism, but also he's inventing words. Rose frail and blue veined is sort of a compound word there. And he's putting those together as an invention strategy, like we see with make it new, make new words out of two separate words. So those are examples of imagism that we see in modernist work. The next example is also from the modernist movement, and that is the Glory of Women by Siegfried Sassoon. Siegfried Sassoon was a World War I soldier, and he saw all of the horrors. World War I, probably you've studied this in history, but World War I was the first time that warfare took on a mechanized element. In other words, instead of shooting with rifles or pistols or bayonets or swords, World War I is the first time that there are howitzers, machine guns that can just mow down whole groups of people. And so the carnage that happened in World War I was unprecedented. And this poem brings up the horrors of war through the lens of people who didn't go to war. It's about how a soldier is writing about how people in society are anxious to praise the soldier and give him, medals and decorations for his uniform, but they don't really understand what that soldier had to go through. And it's a little bit of a cynical look at those people who just like to throw parades and, cheer for the veterans without understanding what could be happening and what those soldiers had to go through in order to get those medals. They didn't do it for the medals, in other words, and that's trivial to them. It says, you love us when we're heroes, home on leave, or wounded in a mentionable place. You worship decorations. You believe that chivalry redeems the war's disgrace. So right there, you can see the opposing idea. The soldier thinks that war is a disgrace. The people who are not in the position of the soldier think that it's chivalrous. And then you get this really interesting line, you make us shells. I think there's a footnote on there about how people who were not in the war were working in factories to make ammunition and things for the war effort. So they would shift over from making, like a factory's making whatever it's supposed to make, canned goods or whatever, and they would change so that they could make ammunition to send to the war effort. And so literally you can read that line, you make us shells, like shells for guns. But you can also read that line saying you make us shells, meaning you turn us into shells of people when you only celebrate these decorations that we are given. You listen with delight about the things that traumatized us. You can't believe that British troops retire or retreat when hell's last horror breaks them and they run, trampling the terrible corpses blind with blood. So this is kind of an angry poem talking about that conflict between how general public idealizes war and soldiers, but the soldiers had to deal with the reality of that. The last line is especially haunting. Oh, German mother dreaming by the fire while you are knitting socks to send your son, his face is trodden deeper in the mud. He's already dead. So you can see that World War I had an effect on the literature of the modernist movement and, kind of poignant in its delivery of those types of realizations. The next poem is by William Butler Yeats. This is a sad poem too, and kind of inevitable. It's about how it's called When You Are Old, but it's also, kind of about the passing of love and the passing of life. We don't think about these things a whole lot when we're younger because you're not old and gray yet when you're younger. But, think about your grandparents and how nostalgic they are. I know my dad is 80 and he always wants to tell me about, how in the old neighborhood he would play with this kid or how this kid had that car and, just all of his old playmates from his times when he was, teenager and in his 20s. And that's kind of like how old people are. They're going back over their lives, and this poem is kind of like that. There's a little bit of a shift here that gets a little bit personal, but basically it's about how we all have sorrows and we all have that sense of nostalgia when we get older. The next one is moving into postmodernism, and you can tell because of the date of publication here, 1952, and also just the style. Postmodernist is different from modernism because postmodernist will acknowledge the gray side of life and say, you know what, life is difficult, but we have to try to push on. So they acknowledge the difficulties and try to find ways to live for that little bit of hope or that little light in life. And this is a perfect poem to demonstrate that. Do not go gentle into that good night. This is a VNL, which is a 20th century invention pretty much. And the structure of it is set up to repeat at specific intervals. So you have your first stanza, lines 1 and 3 are repeated throughout the entire poem. You can see that I've highlighted them here on my example. So what gets repeated is usually the most important element or idea in the poem. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Now you can read night and light as symbolic in a couple different ways, right? Like night could be death, light could be life, night could be, like despair, and light could be hope. So, you know, the poem in general is talking about how we should try to guard against that darkness taking over completely, or that we should fight against death and try to live our full lives. And so you can see how this poem demonstrates the tension between acknowledging that life is a challenge, but also making it important to continue to strive for that little scrap of hope, that little bit of light. And it ends with those two lines again here. After he talks about different types of men, he focuses in on his father. And most scholars think that that this poem was written um, specifically on the occasion of his father passing away. So, try to keep going if you can. The last poem for today is also a postmodern piece by Seamus Heaney, an Irishman, and also our translator for Beowulf, if you remember his name. And so Blackberry Picking is a poem. It's a narrative poem, which the other ones aren't really. It's a narrative poem that has two parts to it. And there's a big shift. The first part is about how when it's like a remembrance that when he was younger, they used to go out when all of the blackberries would ripen in August and pick all of them. And the first part describes how they would go running out and they would just literally take every blackberry, whether it was ripe or not, off the berries, and they would just get every container that they could find and fill them to the brim with these blackberries. And they would eat as many as they could. It was delicious and lovely, but then there's a big shift. And there's a shift because they can't eat all of the blackberries that they picked. And what happens is they go bad. And there's a rat gray fungus that grows on the berries. The juice ferments and it turns sour. And then you end up with this final image, which brings us to the theme of the poem, which is, I always felt like crying. It wasn't fair that all the lovely canfuls smelt of rot. each year I hope they'd keep, knew they would not. So there's that same element that we saw in the previous poem, right? Do not go gentle into that good night, because the idea is knowing that they were going to overpick all the blackberries and they would end up losing a ton of them to being spoiled. They still went out the next year and still did the same thing, right? Like hoping that it wouldn't happen. But that's nature. Nature's on its own course. So it's like acknowledging that nature, things decay in nature, but it's the human sort of desire that doesn't happen. And so that hopefulness is contained. There is some a little bit of foreshadowing in this first part. If you read it, you probably noticed that there's an element as there's this description of these children running out to pick these blackberries. There are a couple of diction points, right? There's a couple points where the process is described in ways that kind of foreshadow what's going to happen to the blackberries. And for example, they're eating the blackberries and he calls one a glossy purple clot. Well, that's not a pleasant word. Like if I said, oh, here, eat this clot, you wouldn't want that, because we usually associate the word clot with blood and like coagulated blood. They also talk about Summer's blood was in it. So there's a connection there between clot and Summer's blood. And there's like a tinge of the morbid to this blackberry hunt that's going on. So they grab everything and then they have some that are big dark blobs that burned like a plate of eyes. Again, that sort of morbid, nobody wants to think about a plate of eyes, like you would eat them. And then our hands were peppered with thorn pricks, our palms sticky as Bluebeard. Bluebeard killed his own wife. And so it's about the blackberry stains that are on their hands from picking, and the juice, has sort of covered them. And he's comparing that to Bluebeard's hands after he murdered his own wife. So there are little hints, like in the beginning part of this poem, about what will happen in the second part here. But the hope is alive at the end. And even though there's a disappointment here, they're still continuing to go and look for the blackberries. So I put a note over here, trying to maintain hope amid the grim realizations of life. So the question is that where we still are with literature? Or is it something else now? And I guess we'll find out. When your children go to literature class, they'll probably be able to tell you later on. All right, any questions? Is there any of those poems that you want me to spend a little more time on for you? All right, for Tuesday, actually I was on the right screen. For Tuesday, you need to read the Virginia Woolf piece, The Mark on the Wall. Also, that's the day that your essay is due. So we're kind of jammed up with stuff this one weekend because there's discussion number 9, essay number 2, and also the reading of that piece. So on Tuesday, we'll talk about that Virginia Woolf piece. On Thursday, we'll talk about Mansfield's Garden Party. The Mark on the Wall is pretty short. The Garden Party is a little bit longer. And then after that, your only focus will be on the final exam. Do you want me to talk about any of those things? Do you want me to talk about the exam? I did that on Tuesday somewhat, or the paper. Any specific questions about those things? They're big grades coming up, so I just want to make sure that we've covered anything that you might wonder about. All right, I don't see anything here in the chat. So if something comes up and you need a little bit of help with your paper, or you have a question about the discussion or anything like that, just shoot me an email and I will be glad to see what I can do to help you. All right. I hope that y'all have a good day, and I will see you next on Tuesday. Bye.
Bye, miss.
Bye. Have a good day.